This is pretty cool. I'm normally a lot more comfortable out in the wild and outdoors, and very rarely, thankfully, have I been at a campsite with this many people. It's nice to come to a place where everyone can agree that we're here to think about new things and talk about different ideas and feel a bit of compromise and be open to new things. Unfortunately, the world doesn't seem to portray what's happening inside this room today broadly. We're missing out on compromise. We're missing out on empathy. We're missing out on taking care of one another, I think, in this country, and it doesn't seem like much is getting done at all. However, this year marks the celebration of one of the greatest pieces of legislation that I think this country has ever passed. It was so incredible, so wanted, and so core to the American identity that it passed with unanimous approval in the Senate and had only 13 dissenting voices in the House. What was it? The Wilderness Act. 50 years ago, this country decided we needed a place that could be untrammeled by man. And since then, we've protected almost 110 million acres, 757 separate areas, 44 different states, and in Puerto Rico, totaling a total of 5% of our entire land mass that is not allowed to have any more roads, condos, casinos, or permanent structures of any kind. And you've got to walk on in. No cars, no motorcycles, but you can take a llama or a horse if you so choose. Imagine the confusion today if our national media had to find a way to report on near unanimous bipartisan legislation on any issue, let alone legislation that existed just to leave land and water alone. Mind-blowing. More amazing to me, however, is the Wilderness Act in context. 1964 was only 7 years after the forced integration of Little Rock Central High School. 2 years after the National Guard was called in to ensure the successful integration of James Meredith, who was the first black student at the University of Mississippi, and only 2 months after the bitterly contested Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. This was also, mind you, in the middle of escalation of violence and the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. As our country went through what I would argue was one of the worst times as trying to understand who we were as a people, as a nation, and what it meant to live in the land of the free and the home of the brave, we put aside all of our differences long enough to pass legislation that cynically could be looked at simply to protect empty space. Perhaps we should move Congress back to the woods again today. On its face, the Wilderness Act is truly unbelievable. I think if you grew up looking at the political spectrum or only reading Corey's blogs from the last 14 years, I think what you'd see is that the Wilderness Act seems like a fairy tale. We might as well try to explain that dragons really did exist. Then there was a time when all of the Senate could agree on something and only 13 members of Congress dissented. Rumor has it 12 of them weren't even there that day to vote. Now, it's not a perfect piece of legislation, this Wilderness Act. It creates a legal definition for what is wild and what isn't. I think it sets up a hierarchy of the different types of outdoors, and that's not always a good thing. I think the other thing to note about the Wilderness Act is that it creates, in some ways, a little bit more separation between we as people, as humankind, as mankind, and nature. And I think that that's something that the original inhabitants of this land, the original inhabitants of Europe, would find really strange, because I don't know if you can actually separate man from nature. We are nature. Yet, that generation of leaders 50 years ago had a strong physical connection to the land. They grew up outside. Whether they were in an urban or rural or a suburban environment, people simply played more and longer out of doors than they do today. There was still a strong understanding of a particular American philosophy towards the land. Our story as a nation is actually built on the notion of man versus wild. And we need to move it to an understanding of man with wild. It was taming of the wilderness that made this nation great. It created this notion of a frontier landscape and rugged individualism. And while we're proud of our cities and our towns and our architectural achievements. We're far more proud of our Davy Crockett's and our Daniel Boones. And without wilderness, none of that exists. And so they recognized we needed to protect this, not so much for the generation in 1964, but for us and for future generations. However, in 1984, I was not aware of this rich history. I was barely aware of my own history. I had just been plucked up from my first memories in Botswana and moved here to Brookings, South Dakota. Rumor has it, and my mom's in the crowd today, you can ask her on the break, that back in Botswana, I wouldn't cry if I had a full diaper as long as I was playing outside. Bring me inside, and the wails begin. Hindsight being 2020, it's not a surprise the path that I've taken. Ultimately, we moved to a neighborhood a few blocks south of the train tracks that split Brookings in two and just a couple blocks north of what was then the end of town, right before the fields seemed to stretch off endlessly all the way down towards Texas. Just before you got to those fields, there was a drainage ditch that my brother and I called the pond. It was a big, scary, gigantic pipe you could stand up in, maybe not so much today. There were tall grasses, frogs, and birds, and from time to time, enough water that you could actually skip a stone. For the two of us, it was heaven, and though we knew that place intimately, our imaginations allowed it to be a blank spot on the map every time we showed up. We spent hours of our childhood there, exploring new lands and kicking off epic expeditions. And where sadly, one fateful day, perhaps around 1988, I ruined my Safety Town graduation shirt. And a muddy, full frontal splashdown on a failed jump across the ditch. I came home in tears. I think my mother thought I had broken my arm or my back, but I was worried about the Safety Town clown. I was saddened when in my early teens, probably for all the right safety and sanitary reasons, they filled in that ditch and the pond was no more. But the seeds had been planted and the roots already started to grow inside of me. While that pond never would have been protected under the Wilderness Act or made into a city park as perhaps the younger Stacy Bare would have wanted, it was a space I could go to be wild and free, and that's the point. But in the summers away from that pond, my parents would take my brother and I on fantastic road trips across the country, down into Mexico, up into Canada, on family vacations, where in the vinyl back seats of a Pontiac or later a big blue diesel station wagon, we would stare at maps, stop at historical highway road signs, read through AAA road tour books, and visit small town museums on our way to the beach. If you ask my wife today what she's most infuriated about in our relationship, it's that I'm always wanting to stop and read the roadside signs. It's an incredible education. A common refrain from my mother was to put down your books and look at the trees. Fair enough. We were from South Dakota. We don't have a lot of trees, and we didn't in the 80s. But when you can find great joy in a neighborhood drainage ditch, you can be overwhelmed with the possibilities that are open to you for anyone willing just to walk into those forests, stare at those rivers, and think about what's just beyond that next mountain range or desert skyscape. And as a kid, and now as an adult, I still lust after those places. I dream about what it was like to be a pioneer or an explorer. And better yet, I dream about what it was like to be a Lakota or a Shoshone warrior in the decades and centuries before the highways and rest stops and roadside motels invaded this land. But so it was, in 1996, I decided to head out, to leave Brookings on my own grand adventure, and ended up at the same place, minus the National Guard, where James Meredith had started at the University of Mississippi. Things were different in northern Mississippi than they were here in eastern South Dakota. First off, because of my various orientation name tags that said I was from SD, most people assumed I was from San Diego. That was pretty cool. Then I had to explain I was from South Dakota. People were confused. I remember when one guy took me aside and he said, "Hey man, at least you're from the right Dakota." Now, we all know that to be true. However, we didn't split from North Dakota for the same reasons that the South may have left the North. Anyway, my last couple years in college, I went on my own journey through the metaphorical wilderness of faith. I stopped in at a number of different churches throughout the South, and somewhere between attendance at Oxford First Baptist and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, I attended a few revivals. And friends, if you've never been to a real Southern Baptist revival, it's a wonderful thing. Typically out on a big flat space, we can get that here in South Dakota, or out in a parking lot, all week long or over a long weekend, pastors and preachers, reverends and ministers, choirs and casserole dishes would be flooded underneath a big top tent to spark salvation among listeners, to bring in the lost of the flock, convert the unbelievers, and light a fire in those who were already converted. The goal, if we were blessed, if we were lucky enough, if we prayed hard enough, would be that revival would spread across this country like a wildfire, bringing everyone back into what was righteous and good, and we would be unified by salvation. I ultimately left Ole Miss. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army and started out on points known for many other people, but were blank on the map for me. First to my officer basic course in Arizona, on into Germany, all throughout Europe, over down to Bosnia. And in some stroke of bad luck at the time, I really thought it was bad luck, I never got to go to my generation's war in Iraq or Afghanistan. Imagine it this way. If you've trained your whole life to be a butcher, but you never get to see a pig, what's the point? But by the time I took off my uniform, I thought it would be the last time in the spring and summer of 2004. I spun the globe, and I was off to Angola, and later on to the former Soviet state of Georgia, where after about 9 months of good living taking landmines out of the ground in the breakaway province of Abkhazia, where these horses are running free, the Army reached back out to me on my Yahoo email account, giving me the chance to come back to the United States and visit Baghdad. I say giving me the chance, but as it wasn't so much a question as it was a request. In 2006 and 2007, I went to Baghdad. After a year of my service, I got dropped off in Hartford, Connecticut. My brother was 15 minutes late to the airport to pick me up. I had a small amount of time to think about what was going to happen next now that I was really and truly out of the uniform. Today, I grow my beard in such a way that it only grows in the place where the Army wouldn't let me have hair. Nature has done the rest. The transition, however, was not smooth. And in 2009, I can look back now on the symptoms and challenges of post-traumatic stress, adjustment disorder, depression, and a mild traumatic brain injury, which is precisely why I'm speaking off notes, I'd think, manifesting primarily as drug and alcohol abuse. It was a struggle until my buddy Chuck got me out rock climbing. Not long after, my brother and I spent 10 days visiting huge landscapes and truly wild areas in the Canyonlands and in between the river and rim of the Grand Canyon. Again, I had found the pond. But this was on a scale I never could have imagined when my mother encouraged me just to look at the trees. It's no small statement to say that I was hooked and later saved by the outdoors. We talk in this country about the merits of a nationalized healthcare system, about the challenges of what it is to get good health care. But we already have the world's largest clinical, public, and preventative healthcare system. It's in our public lands. But what is it? What is it about these wild and open spaces, or just staring at a tree as you rake for the 1,000th time that fall? What is it about these spaces that allowed me to heal, to really and truly come home? And I'm not alone in this. This is happening for thousands of veterans. It's been happening since the start of time, and it's been happening for everybody, regardless of when they went to war or even if they did go to war. I think the answer is in grace. The wilderness accepts you for who you are. It doesn't care your color, your race, your creed, your sexuality. It doesn't care if you've ever shot anybody or been shot at. You can yell, you can scream, you can sit quietly and read poetry, you can scramble up to the highest mountaintops, or you can just sit and stare. Wilderness, wildness, it's in all of us. It's where we came from as a species. It can't be legislated for or against. It's there, it's in you. This room, as beautiful as it is, this is not natural. What is natural is outside those doors. on the Great Plains, what used to be the Great Prairies, and in small segments still is. That's what's natural. And if you believe in God, if you believe that you've got to believe that this is what God intended. If you believe in the story of Adam and Eve, if you've read about Eden, what's missing from Eden? Structure, cubicles, the internet. So why, I wonder, if we really believe, and there's several major religions out there that do, that we are indeed the great-great-grandchildren of Adam and Eve, why do we build dams? Why do we stop rivers? Why do we tear down mountains? Isn't it enough to have the passflower bloom, to have the bobcat out there somewhere, to have a crooked creek? There's not a lot of high school or college mascots that talk about what man has built. Instead, they talk about what nature has given us. I'm sometimes asked, do I ever get scared when I'm outside? Am I not ever worried about a charge from a grizzly bear or a mountain lion? And the answer is yes. But not in the way I was worried about sniper fire. Not in the way I was worried about an improvised explosive device. I recently had the good fortune to sit down and chat with naturalist, advocate, and Vietnam veteran Doug Peacock. He spent 35 years tracking grizzly bears after 2 tours in Vietnam. He's been charged by the bear. And I asked, do you feel trauma from that? And he looked at me and he said, no. No, I do not. The grizzly bear charge is life-affirming. It's what the grizzly is supposed to do. The stench of burned human flesh atop of each other is not. Trauma comes from that which isn't natural. Now, once upon a time my parents can certainly remember, many of you can remember, but I don't know if I can. But we used to live in a nation that, despite all of our other differences, and I think perhaps because of them, we came together to make sure we could get back out and find those places, find those spaces where life could be so well affirmed. You don't have to wait for the grizzly bear to charge. In fact, I would recommend it against it. But you can go out to those places where you can get to know one another and you can get to know yourself, minus all the other impediments in life that create inequalities. And in those spaces, because you're reconnecting with who you are, I think you can find some dose, some drop of salvation. But now we're at a time in our history where we absolutely have to have a revival. We've got to have a revival of wilderness. And if we were back in Mississippi, now is the time where I'd invite you down to the front of the stage. I'd ask the rest of you to get your hands in the air, and we would lay hands on you. We would pray that God would move in you towards salvation. And I can tell you, climbing on 9/11, this is an experience that happens frequently on top of mountains, in rivers, out on desert hikes. But today I'm going to ask something else. Maybe you do feel the hand of God moving. Maybe as you drove to this event today, you saw a lowly sparrow or a lonely robin. That's nature too. That's wild. I ask you to head outside to the temples of an amazing natural world. Find your own spirit. It doesn't have to be a mountaintop. It doesn't even have to be in one of the 109.5 million acres that this country has decided to save. It could be an anthill on your driveway if you can find yourself to humble before nature there. It can be a dandelion in the boulevard. It's only we who make it a weed. And please, when you go, take someone with you.